Hi. Okay. Uh, so we'll get started with today's session. So there's the second session where we are discussing lectures 4 to 6. These are some important links. The link to the live session, the link for the YouTube channel, and the link to the Google Drive folder where all the presentations are shared. So you have the first presentation where you have this slide where you can also access all these links. So the current module that we'll discuss today is ecological structure, which had three lectures: the levels of organization, species abundance and composition, and another lecture on biodiversity. And in the next module, which is the next week, we'll look at ecological interactions. So we'll get started. So before we learn about the levels of organization, uh, we first have to understand why are there different levels of organization. So Herbert Simon used this example called the parable of two watchmakers to describe the complex relationships between subsystems and their larger wholes. So the parable goes something like this. So there once were two watchmakers named Hora and Tempus who made very fine watches. The phones in their workshops rang frequently and new customers were constantly calling them. However, Hora prospered while Tempus became poorer and poorer, and in the end, Tempus lost his shop. What was the reason behind this? So the reason is, in a word, it's hierarchy, but I'll explain the whole thing. So the watches that Hora and Tempest made consisted of around 1,000 parts each. Uh, the way that Tempest designed those watches was that if he had to put down a partly assembled watch, it immediately fell into pieces, and he had to reassemble everything from the basic elements. Hora, however, had designed his watches in such a way that he can put together sub-assemblies of around 10 components each, and each sub-assembly could then be put down without falling apart. Then these 10 of the sub-assemblies could be put together to make a larger sub-assembly, and if you combine a lot of larger sub-assemblies, like 10 of them, you get the whole watch. So what basically happened is that when so let's say this is Tempest making the watch. And on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have how much of the watch is completed, percentage of the watch that is completed, or the number of, let's say, the number of uh, parts that he has put together. Okay, so let's say this is 1,000. So basically, if you have put together 1,000 parts, your watch is done. So with Tempest, what happens is that he starts putting together the watch. After a point, he receives a call. He has to put down the watch. Everything falls apart. So he has to start from the beginning. And he goes again, putting together. And again, the phone rings. And basically, everything falls apart. And this can continue for a long time. And there might be some days where Tempest is not able to make even a single watch. Now, if you look at what happens with Hora, so the same thing. We have time here. We have number of parts here. This is 1,000. So with Hora, what happens is, so he has put together some sub-assemblies, then the phone rings, so he has to put it down. So some of the parts that are not exactly fully put together will basically fall, but the rest of the sub-assemblies that were put together will basically stick. So the next time after the phone, he has to basically continue from here. So even if he gets like 10 different calls or 20 different calls, he can still complete at least one watch in a day. Right. So every day he's able to make the watch and he's able to set up his shop and prosper. So once this watch is done, he'll probably start with another one. Then again, there's a call, and then he completes it. So what we learn from this is that Quora has a hierarchical way of doing things. So basically, initially he puts together pieces of 10. Then these pieces are combined and put together to make more larger subassemblies, which are then again used to make the whole watch. Right. So this is the smallest subassembly that consists of 10 parts. This is the one level above. Which basically has 10 of these things put together. And this has basically 10 of the previous things put together to get the whole watch. So basically, Hora has a hierarchical way of doing things. And what this does is it introduces a kind of stability into the system so that even if Hora is disturbed by a phone call or a new customer trying to buy a watch, he does not suffer a lot of consequences that is there for tempers, for example, because he doesn't have a hierarchical way of putting together the watch. So Simon gave this hierarchical principle where he said that hierarchy emerges almost inevitably through a wide variety of evolutionary processes for the simple reason that hierarchical structures are stable. What are examples of hierarchical structures? So, for example, in nature, you find centipedes. So, centipedes are basically like these organisms which have around 100 legs, but their body is composed of many different segments, each with 2 legs. So it's basically a repetition of a small, so the whole centipede can be thought of as a assembly of these small segments. And there are other different levels of organizations or hierarchical ways of putting together things in biology that we'll talk about in a while. One thing that happens when you have a hierarchical structure is that some properties starts to emerge. If you put together smaller things together, you get a bigger thing, but it also has some properties that are emergent that were not there before in the smaller things. So the emergent principle basically states that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the function that the whole thing can provide is something that the parts cannot itself provide, or even if you have a sequence of those parts, they cannot, you cannot sum up the whole thing to provide the function that is being provided by the whole. And the other thing is the whole has properties that its parts do not have. So one example of emergent properties and emergent behavior is fire ants forming a raft. So basically these fire ants, they are like basically ants. So what happens, let's say there are a lot of these ants walking around in a line or something, and suddenly there's a lot of water, there's let's say a flash flood or something. And typically, if these ants are separate and they are walking alone, it's most likely that they'll get submerged in the water and die. So what they do is they make this form of a raft where each individual is holding another individual by its leg so as to not bite it or like cause a lot of issues to the other ant, but still it's able to hold on. So what happens when a lot of these ants hold each other like this? One second. Can you guys see my screen? Hello?
Yes, sir, we can hear.
Can you guys see the screen also?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, so basically what happens when these ants form these rafts? So they have a lot of air pockets in between them, which trap air and give them a sort of buoyancy so that even if a single individual ant is drowning, this whole raft structure will float in the water. And thus these ants are able to survive. So this aggregation or this aggregation basically also has some emergent properties that are not found in its components, that is the ants. So for example, let's say we have one ant. So basically one of the characteristics of this raft that is different from the ants is hydrophobicity. So hydrophobicity is how much a surface is repelling water. Hydro means water and phobic means fear. So let's say you have a surface which is hydrophilic. Again, hydro means water and philic means love. So we have a surface that loves water. So if you put a drop of water, what happens? The water basically stays like this. So the angle that the drop of water forms with the surface is acute. So hydrophilic substances form acute angles with water. However, hydrophobic substances, when you put a drop of water on them, such as the ant here, the droplet tries to stay like this. So the angle that you get between the surface and the drop of water is an obtuse angle. So basically, by measuring the angle of a water droplet on a surface, we can measure the hydrophobicity of a surface. So in an experiment, what people did was they put a drop of water on ants and they measured this angle. So the angle between the surface of the ant and the water. And they also did the same thing with a group of ants, which are forming an aggregation or a raft. So they figured out that the angle here, this theta 2, let's say, and this is theta 1, theta 2 is greater than theta 1. That means the raft is more hydrophobic than a single ant. So this is one of the emergent properties that comes about when ants aggregate to form rafts. Other emergent properties are elasticity. So the first case here, basically, if you have a single ant and you squeeze it with a petri dish, it'll of course die or be crushed. But if you have an aggregation of ants like this and you push it down using a petri dish, it'll go down. But then if you remove the petri dish, it'll again come back up. So now the whole thing is elastic. It's not like, do you see? You can't squeeze it full like you can squeeze an ant and like, yeah, kill an ant. Then the second property that emerges for fire ant groups of fire ants is viscosity. So viscosity is a property of fluids. So for example, let's say you have water here and we have honey here. Okay. Water is less viscous than honey or less dense than honey. Honey is more dense. So if you were to put a metal ball through this, the rate at which it will go down will be faster than the rate at which the same metal ball will go down through a column of honey of the same size. So basically, this is a measure of the viscosity. So a single ant does not have any viscosity, but if you put together a group of ants, then it has some amount of viscosity and fluid properties because now you can put a metal ball and it will pass through it like it was passing through a fluid like water or honey. So two emergent properties here. One is elasticity and the other one is viscosity. Does anyone have any doubts or questions till now? Okay. So as I was saying, hierarchy provides a stable structure, and in biological world, we have different levels of organizations or different hierarchy. So it starts with subcellular organelles, which are basically organelles that perform functions inside a cell. Then we have cells, which are the basic fundamental units of life. Cells aggregate to form tissues. Tissues aggregate to form organs. Organs come together to form an organ system, which performs a certain function. A set of organ systems come together to form an organism, which is basically the living, breathing uh, unit of life, the living unit of life. Yeah. Then from organism, you have populations. Then population is basically an aggregation of different organisms of the same type. Then we have communities, which is aggregation of organisms of different type or populations of different organisms. And A community gives rise to an ecosystem, which is basically the abiotic and biotic components taken together. Ecosystems are then classed into biomes, and biomes finally into the biosphere. So we'll look at each of them in more detail. So a subcellular organelle is basically a specialized subunit within a cell that has a specific function. For example, uh, the mitochondria, which is shown here, basically is the powerhouse of the cell and generates energy for the cell. Chloroplasts are basically found in plant cells and they help synthesize food from sunlight. Nucleus is what governs a cell and also contains the DNA. Then cell is the next level of organization, which is the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all known living organisms and the smallest unit of life. So the smallest living thing that you can have is a microbe, which is basically a single cell. Cells then combine together to form tissues. Tissues are basically ensembles of similar cells and their extracellular matrices. So a lot of different cells of the similar type, and they're present in some matrix that is outside the cell. So this is called extracellular matrix. And basically, they together carry out a specific function. So for example, nervous tissue has nerve cells and it's present in our brain. Blood has RBCs, WBCs. So basically, blood has RBCs, which has cells, and plasma, which is the extracellular matrix in which the cells are present. Similarly, for bones, we have like bone cells and extracellular matrix in which they are present. And such, we have different types of tissues that we find in different organisms. Even in plants, we have different tissues such as xylem and phloem. Now, organs are the next level of organization. Tissues come together to form organs, which are basically collection of tissues with similar functions. So we have lots of different organs that we know about that carry out specific functions. For example, stomach digests food, and um, yeah, stomach basically helps in digestion. Kidney helps in filtration of waste. Bladder helps to store all the urine that is produced. Pancreas generate insulin that is also helped in that helps in digestion of carbohydrates in food. After organs, we have organ system, which is basically a group of organs that work together to perform one or more function. On the left hand side here, we have the digestive system, which is basically a group of all the different organs that we saw before, like liver, gallbladder, small intestine, large intestine, stomach, and mouth, esophagus, a tongue. So all of them are different organs and they are coming together to perform one function, which is digestion of food. Right. Now, a lot of different organ systems come together to produce an organism. An organism is an individual entity that exhibits the properties of life, like finding food, eating food, movement, respiration, procreation, etc. Many organisms come together to form a population. So all the organisms of the same group or species, which are living in a particular geographical area and have the capability of interbreeding, are called a population. The capability of interbreeding basically means that you can take two individuals of the population, breed them, and you will get a fertile offspring. So you get two individuals from a population, you breed them, and whatever you get is a fertile offspring that can also reproduce. Now, a community is a group or association of populations of two or more different species occupying the same geographical area and in a particular time. So, for example, here we see these groups of elephants, wildebeest, and zebras, giraffes basically coming together and associating and living in the same geographical area and interacting with each other. We also have other kinds of interactions, such as these wildebeest and lion, where basically the lion is a predator trying to hunt one of these. Now, an ecosystem is basically a community along with its abiotic components. So basically, we have all the different animals and birds that are living in this area combined with the abiotic components of that area, such as water, sunlight and heat, temperature, humidity, etc. All of these define an ecosystem. Now, we find all these ecosystems, such as like you find deserts here in India and Thar, and you also find deserts in Sahara in Africa. So basically, a biome is a community of plants and animals that have common characteristics because they belong to the same ecosystem but in different geographical places. So the desert ecosystem is an ecosystem which contains all the desert plants and animals. Right. And because they are living in a desert and they share some characteristics such as very low precipitation, very high temperatures, and all that. So the animals and plants that are found in the deserts in India are similar to the animals, have similar characteristics to the animals and plants found in deserts elsewhere in the world. That's why these different ecosystems are classed together to form a biome. And when you basically basically the biosphere is the worldwide sum of all the ecosystems that we have. It is basically the portion of Earth that supports life. So atmosphere, which is the air around us, lithosphere, which is basically the soil and everything else, and hydrosphere, which is basically water bodies, and the conjunction of all of these, where animals and birds and other creatures are found and life sustains, is basically called the biosphere. Does anyone have any questions till now? Okay, great. So we'll move on to the second lecture, which was about species abundance and composition. So basically, when you go to a jungle, what all do you see in a jungle? You see a lot of different things in the jungle. You see a lot of trees. You see, uh, so basically, these trees have structures. So there might be very high trees, which form basically the canopy of the forest. You or a jungle, you have smaller trees which form the understory. Then we have some herbs and grasses and all that on the ground. You see a lot of animals, like for example, and if you go to a jungle, you see probably monkeys, tigers, deers, and all that, and you see them interacting with each other. You see a lot of birds. Birds might be resident, which is that they stay in the same area throughout the year, or they might be migratory, which means that they are staying in one geographical area for some time, and they move to another area because of like breeding grounds or to find food and all that. You might also see things such as pug marks, which are like marks left by animals on the soil. So basically footprints of tigers and stuff. You also see scat, which is basically fecal matter. And many a times you can identify animals using their scat. That is how uh, like tiger census and leopard census was done. Like now they now people are using camera trapping, but also people still use pug marks and scat to estimate the number of individuals of tiger and lion that are present in different forests or different areas. You see a lot of reptiles, you see a lot of different flowers and their pollinators or insects. There are termites, there are termite mounds. Then you have some decomposers such as mushroom, which basically grow on dead and decaying matter, and they uh, basically get the nutrients from there and then give it back to the soil. If you have some water body, you might see animals such as frogs or turtles or even fishes inside the water body. So all this comprises of biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variety of life in all its forms and at all levels of organizations. So there are two key things here: in all its forms and at all levels of organization. So what do we mean by that? So in all its forms means the all the different kinds of forms that we see of life. For example, plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, fungi, bacteria, and other microbes. And at all levels of organization means the biodiversity or the diversity can be characterized at the levels of gene, can be characterized at the level of species, and at the level of ecosystem also. So what is species biodiversity? First of all, what is species? Species is basically a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. So again, what does we learned what is interbreeding? What is actually or potentially interbreeding? So basically what this means is, so let's say you have a population of tigers in Kanha and you have a population of tigers in, let's say, Mudumalai. Okay. So these are different populations belonging to different regions in India, right? But if you take an individual from here and you take another individual from here and you mate them, you'll get a fertile offspring. That means that these are potentially interbreeding. They're not actually interbreeding because they're geographically separated from each other, but they can potentially interbreed if they're given the chance. And what is reproductive isolation? So basically, so this is a species. Now let's say you take one individual from this, which is a tiger, and you take, let's say from Gir, you take a lion and you try to mate them, right? So either they won't mate, or if they mate, the offspring they produce will not be fertile. So that basically means that these two animals are reproductively isolated from each other. So basically, species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations, which are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Species diversity asks two questions. How many species are there in a given area and how are they distributed? Like, so for example, the Western Ghats might have a lot of different species of birds, right? You might see a lot of different types of birds. Uh, let's say you see like at least 3 species of birds. So that is basically how many species are there. And how are they distributed basically means how many of species 1 are found, how many of species 2 are found, and how many of species 3 are found in the given area. That is basically species biodiversity. Now, the other level at which we can define biodiversity is genes or genetic biodiversity. Now, genes are basically a unit of heredity that is transmitted from parents to offspring. And genetic biodiversity consists of diversity of genetic information present at the levels of different phylum, different families, species, populations, and also individuals. So the two examples of genetic biodiversity when we are calculating. So the first thing is a polymorphism, which is denoted by P. Polymorphism is basically the proportion of or percentage of genes that are polymorphic. So what does polymorphic mean? A gene is considered to be polymorphic if the frequency of the most common allele is less than some arbitrary threshold. Otherwise, it is monomorphic. That is, it is lacking variation. The threshold is usually set at 95%. So what does this basically mean? So let's say you have dogs and you have coat color in dogs. So there are some dogs that are black, some dogs that are white, some dogs that are brown, some dogs that have patches and all that. So basically, let's say this gene C codes for coat color. And in a dog population, you might have different variations of C. So you might have C1, C2, C3, and C4, let's say. And let's say this codes for white color coat and this codes for brown golden and black, right? So these are basically the different alleles or the different forms of the gene that are present, right? So yeah, a gene is considered polymorphic if the frequency of the most common allele is less than some arbitrary threshold. Okay. So let's say now we have a population of dogs. Okay. Let's say we have 10 dogs and we sequence them. Okay. We get all their genetic sequence and we look at this C gene and we check what are the different alleles of the gene that are present in these dogs. So each of the dogs will have two alleles. So it can either be C1, C1 or C1, C2 or C1, C3 and so on. It can be any of the pairs. So what we do is for all the 10 dogs, we get basically all the alleles that are there. So we'll get 20 alleles of C, right? Some of them will be C1, some of them will be C2, some of them will be C3, some of them will be C4, right? Let's say we have 5 here, 2 here, 3 here, and 10 here. Okay, so we have 20 alleles. But so what does our definition say? As if the frequency of the most common allele is less than 95%. So what is the most common allele in this population? So the most common allele is C4. So what is the frequency of that? So the frequency will be 10 divided by 10 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5, which is 20, which is 0.5. So 0.5 is less than 95%. That means this gene that is coding for coat color in dogs is polymorphic because there are many different forms of the gene. So polymorphic comes from two words. Poly means numerous and morph means form. So the numerous forms are different forms, many forms basically. So, but let's say now we had a separate population and in that population, this thing was, let's say 10,000. So we had 10,000 alleles of the type C4. We have 3 alleles of the type C3, 2 of the type C2, and 5 of the type C5, C1, sorry. Now, if we calculate the frequency of this most common allele, it will be 10,000 divided by 10,010, which is very close to 1. So it's greater than 95% or 0.95. Right. So that means this gene virtually is not polymorphic because most of the individuals in the population will have a pair of C4s because that is so abundant in the population. Right. Now, so that is basically polymorphic. So a gene is considered to be polymorphic if the frequency of the most common allele is less than this threshold. Now, polymorphism P is given as the proportion of genes that are polymorphic in a given population, in a given organism, or anything. Right. So, as you mentioned here, genetic diversity can be calculated at the levels of phyla, family, species, and population. So basically, we can have polymorphism at the level of species, at the level of population also. Now, heterozygosity, which is represented by H, is basically another example of genetic biodiversity, which is basically the proportion or percentage of genes at which the average individual is heterozygous. So what basically it means is, so let's say the same case, we have one individual which has C1, C1. That means the individual is homozygous. So both the copies of the gene that it has is basically the same. But if we have two different copies, it is called heterozygous. Right. Now, what heterozygosity is, it is the proportion or percentage of genes at which the average individual is heterozygous. So let's say we have one individual, one dog, okay, and one dog has, let's say, for simplicity, 5 genes, right? It has 5 genes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first one is homozygous, the second one is heterozygous, the third one is homozygous, the fourth one is homozygous, and the last one is also homozygous, right? So what this means is 1 out of the 5 genes are basically heterozygous, right? So the heterozygosity of this individual is 1/5, which is 20%. Okay. Now in a population, we'll have multiple individuals and they can have varying values of heterozygosity based on the different alleles of different genes that they have. So some individual, like let's say this individual has 20% heterozygosity, someone might have 50%, someone might have 70%, someone might have 10%, and so on. So in a population, if we take the average of all this, the value that we arrive at is called the heterozygosity of the population. So the heterozygosity is the proportion at which the average individual of a population is heterozygous, or how much heterozygosity does the average individual of a population have. Is that clear? Yeah. So the next level at which we can define biodiversity is ecosystem. So ecosystem is basically a group of interacting organisms and the physical environment that they inhabit. Ecosystem biodiversity deals with basically how many ecosystems are there and how are they distributed. Right. So for example, let's say you have a piece of land which only has a forest. Right? So there are multiple different trees. It's a forest. Whereas you have, um, right. Let's say you have another piece of land which basically has a forest in one corner, but it also has a pond somewhere here, right? And it has some rocky area here, right? And a bit of grassland here, right? So between these two patches of land, the first one is less biodiverse than the second one because it has a lot more ecosystems, such as the forest, the grassland, the rocky outgrowth, and the pond, right? So that is how we define how many ecosystems are there. And why do we care how they are distributed? Because the distribution of ecosystems provides us with basically uh, can provide new uh, places for organisms to exist. So for example, let's say we have another piece of land, which basically has a forest here, has some grassland here, has some rocky outgrowth here. And in this case, the pond comes here. So it's one part of the pond, one side of the pond is connected to the rocks, right? So the one uh, bank of the pond is basically rocky. So in the first case, what we have is an interface between, so the blank areas are basically trees. Okay. So let's say you have an interface here of water and forest. You have an interface here of so you have an interface here of rocky and forest. Whereas in the second case, you have three interfaces. So you have one between the forest and the pond. You have one between the forest and the rocks, and you have one between the pond and the rocks. So this new area might be suitable for some organisms, and therefore it might inhabit more organisms than the one that is found here. That's why the distribution of ecosystems in an area also matters. Now we know about biodiversity. How do we measure biodiversity? So there are basically two different measures of biodiversity. The first is species richness, which is the number of species that are present. And the second one is basically species evenness. That is the distribution of individuals of different species. Are they equally distributed? Are they unequally distributed? Are there some species which have more individuals? Are there some species which have less individuals? And so on. So generally, when we are quantifying biodiversity in ecology or in biology, mostly we are concerned with species biodiversity because considering genetic biodiversity is too uh, hectic. You have to do a lot of sampling, you have to do a lot of DNA extraction, you have to get a lot of sequences, and it's very expensive and prohibitive. And species is the smallest unit that you can get at without facing these issues. So how do we estimate how many species are there in a given area? So that is figured out by something called the species accumulation curve. So let's say you have a forest, you go to a forest and you do a transect. So a transect is basically, let's say you have a piece of forest, you walk in one direction, right? And every day you go and walk in the same direction and you note down what are the different species that you are seeing. So in the first day, let's say you spot like around 10 or 9 species of animals, right? On the second day, you might spot something new, one more species, or two, three more species. The third day, you might like see a bit more species. So basically, if you plot the number of species versus the number of transects that you're doing, so the x-axis here denotes basically effort or sampling effort. So basically, how many measurements or how many readings are you taking versus the number of species. So here for sampling effort, we have number of transects. So every day we go to the forest and we do a transect and we note down what all different species we see. Right. So this graph will increase like this initially. And after a point, what happens? So the first day you will see the most common species that are found. So species that are found everywhere in the forest. So they're easier to see. And when you sample more and more, you will eventually get at species that are less easy to see. So species that are slightly rare, right? So this graph will keep on increasing. But after a point, what happens is the number of species that you see will not increase that much. It will remain constant or it will change slightly. So when you reach a asymptote in your graph, so which is basically when the slope becomes zero and your graph stays constant, you basically draw a line from where your graph became constant. And that is basically an estimate of the number of species that are present in the given area, habitat or ecosystem. Okay. Now, how do we quantify or measure biodiversity or species diversity? There are different indices that help us mathematically do that. So the first one is called Simpson's Diversity Index. So this is the formula for Simpson's Diversity Index. So here D is Simpson's Diversity Index, S is the number of species in a given area, and PI is the proportion of the ith species. So what it means, so let's say you go to a forest and you count the number of individuals of different species that you find. Okay. So let's say you have species one, species two, species three. You have three species. And this is basically the number of individuals of each species. Let's say you have 10 individuals of this, 20 individuals of this, 50 individuals of species three. Right. And you have a species four, which has 20 individuals also. So what you do is you basically take the sum of the number of all the number of individuals that you have. So 10 plus 20 plus 20 plus 50 is 100. Now P or the proportion Pi. So P for species 1 will be 10 divided by 100, which is 0.1. Here it will be 0.2, here it will be 0.5, here it will be 0.2. So basically this P value, Pi is basically species I's proportion. So P1 is proportion of species 1, P2 is proportion of species 2, P3 is proportion of species 3, and so on. And here we basically have 4 different species. So our S is equal to 4. So if you plug in the formula, we basically have sum of all these different things. So the square of these different things, you sum it up and you basically 1 divided by that number, it gives you the Simpson's diversity index. Now, Simpson's diversity index gives you the diversity, but to find out the evenness or the equitability of that area, what you do is you take a ratio of whatever value you calculated to the maximum value that is possible in that given area. Okay, for that given number of species S. So D for Simpson's index is maximum when each species is represented by only one individual. So in this case, so Dmax will be obtained when we have one individual of each of the species. So what you do is the value that you get, you divide it by the maximum value that you can get, and that is basically the equitability or the evenness. A high evenness means that all species are equally distributed, so there's equal number of individuals of all different species, and a low evenness means that there's one species that is dominating, or very few species that are dominating. Another index we have is the Shannon's diversity index, which basically again uses PI, which is the proportion of ith species, and also uses S, which is the number of species in a given area, and it takes the log of PI and the sum of this to arrive at a value which denotes the diversity of a given area. A high value means a high diversity, low value means low diversity. Again, for Shannon's diversity, we can define an equitability or evenness measure, which is given by H divided by H max, where H max is the maximal possible value of Shannon's diversity index, which is generally given by log of S, where S is the number of species in that given area. So yeah, you don't need to bother with these formulas. They won't be asked to you. So just keep in mind that this is basically how we quantify biodiversity in a given area. Now, all the things that we talked about, the Simpson's diversity index and the Shannon diversity index, are basically measures of alpha biodiversity. What is alpha biodiversity? Alpha biodiversity is the biodiversity that exists within a ecosystem, right? Or in a given place. But there can be other measures of biodiversity, such as beta biodiversity and gamma biodiversity. Beta biodiversity is a diversity that exists among different ecosystems. Okay, so basically, let's say you have a forest here and you have a patch of grassland here, right? So alpha biodiversity helps you quantify what is the diversity in this area and what is the diversity in this area separately. So you count the number of species here, count the number of species here, you get species richness, you can calculate Shannon diversity or Simpson diversity and all that. Now beta diversity is basically what is the diversity of compared between these two. How many species do they have in common? How many species are present only here? How many species are present only here? And all that comes under beta biodiversity. Now, gamma diversity is a diversity that exists in a much larger area, which comprises of multiple different ecosystems and at a larger scale of geographical scale. Now, based on what we learned, mm, we can characterize certain places on Earth as biodiversity hotspots. So biodiversity hotspots are basically areas with very high species richness. So they have a lot of different species, lot of different number of species in that given area. They have high degree of endemism. Endemism basically means that the species that are found in that area are not found anywhere else in the world. Okay. And they have high degrees of threat. So basically, there's a lot of anthropogenic activity or other things that are affecting the hotspots or basically like things like deforestation or things like deforestation, global warming, climate change are basically things that are threatening the species, the endemic species, and all the other different species that are living in these hotspots. So a biodiversity hotspot has these three characteristics. It has high species richness, it has high degree of endemism, and it has high degrees of threat. Now, this is a map of all the biodiversity hotspots that are found in different areas of the world. You see one such biodiversity hotspot which is found in India is the Western Ghats, and many of the species that are found in the Western Ghats are similar to the species that are found in Sri Lanka. So they are clubbed together. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? So next we move on to the third lecture, which is about why do some areas have more biodiversity and some areas have less. So let's say you're looking at a species richness map for birds or mammals or amphibians or anything else. So here you can see that most of the species of birds that are found are generally found in basically this region, I would say. Right. Somewhere closer to the equator. Similarly, you can see for that mammals also, they follow similar distribution where there are more species around the equator, but very less species if you go around the poles. Right. And this pattern is common for like all the different kinds of organisms or uh, all the different kinds of organisms that we find, such as plants, amphibians, even reptiles and all that. But since it's a very common pattern, the question arises, why do these areas have more biodiversity and the other areas, such as the poles, have less biodiversity? So we don't know exactly why this is the case, but there are a lot of different hypotheses that I put forward to explain this. So they are like the evolutionary speed hypothesis, the geographical area hypothesis, interspecific interactions hypothesis, ambient energy hypothesis, and the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Now we'll go through all of them one by one. So the evolutionary speed hypothesis basically states that there is more diversity in areas that have more time to evolve or that have more rapid rates of evolution. Okay. So, for example, let's say this is the sea and we have a island here, right? This is a very old island, probably like thousands of years old, right? And let's say today or yesterday, there's a small volcano here under the sea, which basically erupts and it forms a small island here today or yesterday, right? So this is basically 1 day old, and this is thousands of years old. So of course, this island has a lot more time and it will of course have a higher biodiversity because it has a lot more time for life to come there and for life to evolve and like many different species to form. Whereas this example here, we ideally we won't have any species there, or we'll have a few species which have just come in now. Right. So if a area has more time to evolve, it has more biodiversity. That is the first point. The second point is if there is more rapid rate evolution or the rate of evolution is higher. One example of that can be shorter generation times. So, for example, let's say you have a lion. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. But yeah, so this is a lion and we have a mouse. Right. So a lion, maybe it takes around 6, 7 years to reproduce or produce offspring. Whereas a mice can reproduce and produce offsprings in as less as, let's say, 6 months. Right. So in the time that the lion has produced one offspring by first maturing to a sexual adult and then reproducing. A mouse will have had multiple generations. So around 14 generations will be equal to one generation here. Right. So this mouse has gone through because it has a shorter generation time or shorter uh, time in which it reproduces. It has a more rapid evolution and it can probably give rise to different species because of evolution. Or if you have even smaller organisms such as E. coli or microbes, they have generation times as small as 20 minutes, right? And if you compare 20 minutes to 7 years, the bacteria would have thousands of generations and it would have multiplied into a lot of different organisms. And because of mutation and evolution, it would have basically probably given rise to more number of species than a lion can do in the same given time, right? The other thing that can increase um, evolution and lead to more biodiversity is higher mutation rate because that leads to more differentiation between individuals and that can probably lead to speciation and all that. Another thing that can drive evolution according to the evolutionary that can drive biodiversity according to the evolutionary speed hypothesis is natural selection acting more quickly on certain organisms or on certain groups of animals or birds or plants. The second hypothesis we have is the geographical area hypothesis, which states that there is more diversity in areas which have larger area or which have physically or biologically complex habitats, as these can support more niches for an organism. So what is a niche? A niche is basically the position and role that an organism plays in an ecosystem, right? So yeah, let's say you have a small area here and you have a large area here, right? So here, because there's small area, there'll be limited number of resources. There'll be limited area to reproduce, to have offsprings to basically survive. There'll be more competition, probably, and there'll be less biodiversity. But since this area is larger, it so this area might like if this area is very small, it might also be very homogeneous. So it won't have a lot of different complex habitats also. So it will basically have less number of species. Whereas in a larger area, you might have, let's say, some areas which have different kinds of features, some areas that have other features such as trees or rocks and all that. And basically these different areas or these different places uh, give rise to more complex habitats and the interaction between them, such as the edge of a forest and a rocky outgrowth, can provide for a place or a niche for some organism to develop and to basically stay there, right? To evolve and to stay there. So here, if we have more physically or biologically complex habitats, it can support more niches or more roles that are available for organisms or species to fill up. So we'll have more biodiversity. The next theory is interspecific interactions hypothesis. So what this states is there is more biodiversity in areas with either competition or predation. So basically competition, let's say you have a pond here. Okay. Which has some algae here on top, right? And you have three types of fishes. Let's say triangular fish, square fish, and circular fish. There are three different species of fishes. And all the different fishes eat the same algae. Now, let's say this triangular fish is much better than the other two at eating the algae, right? So what it does is it eats more algae and it tends to reproduce faster and more because it's getting more energy compared to these individuals. So eventually these individuals will keep on rising. So one way that these other two individuals can deal with it is by going extinct. So that's basically not dealing with it. So what happens is this increases and basically these two species die off. So that is competitive exclusion. But another thing that can happen due to competition is called niche partitioning. So what happens is, so let's say there are some small crustaceans here, and there are, let's say, some aquatic plants, right? So let's say this species specializes and starts eating these plants, and this species goes around and eats the crustaceans. So now what happens? You have more biodiversity because due to competition, there has been niche partitioning. So one species has basically given rise to multiple different species that fill different niche, or there are many different species that have different niche and are occupying different niche. So that's why the biodiversity there is higher. The other thing that this hypothesis states is that predation can also increase biodiversity by reducing by retarding competitive exclusion, by reducing the effect of competition. So let's say now these, so there's no niche partitioning. So these fishes are still eating the algae. All of them are trying to eat the algae, all of these different species. So let's say this is the better forager. This is the species that can eat more algae and faster. So it reproduces and produces more individuals. Now let's say we have a predator here, such as an alligator, right? What happens, the alligator doesn't care which kind of fish it eats, it just needs fish to survive. So whatever is the most abundant will be most killed because there are just more number of individuals of this type, right? So what predation does is it balances out the population of all these different species so that all the three different species survive and there is no competitive exclusion. Okay, is that clear? Yeah, you were saying something? Someone is saying something. Hello. Okay. So the next hypothesis we have is called the ambient energy hypothesis. So basically, what this states is that the hypothesis states that there is more biodiversity in areas which have more energy, and because very few species can tolerate climatically unfavorable conditions, so more species are found in areas which are climatically favorable. Okay, so a direct consequence of this is that since if you look at the globe, the equator is probably the place that receives the maximum amount of sunlight and heat. So it has the most amount of primary producers which are using the sunlight to prepare food. And because there's more number of primary producers, it supports a lot more number of secondary consumers. So that's why we have more species there. Whereas in the Arctic regions, you don't get enough sunlight. So there's not a lot of energy to harvest, and therefore there's a lot less species because this much limited amount of energy can only sustain limited amount of species, right? The other thing is climate also comes uh, into part because climate, many species have different tolerances and very narrow or specific tolerances of things like temperature and humidity and salinity and all that. So basically, not all species can survive everywhere. So wherever conditions are more favorable, those places will have more species. And wherever conditions are less favorable, those places will have less species. For example, if we look at here, even though this area falls near the equator, it is mostly less species rich because it's mostly a desert, the Sahara Desert, right? And it's very unfavorable climatically for organisms to survive. The next hypothesis is intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which state that there is less biodiversity in areas with very high or frequent disturbances due to extinction of species, and less biodiversity in areas with very low or infrequent disturbances, because this leads to competitive equilibrium and loss of species of low competitive ability. So what this basically means is that, let's say you have a forest and it can have, let's say, 3 degrees of disturbances. So the first is very high degree of disturbance or very frequent disturbance. So let's say people are going and cutting all the trees every year. So every year the area is just basically a stump yard. So there are just stumps of trees. There are no trees or there are very few trees. Medium disturbances, like some of it is cut down, some of it is still there, right? And low or infrequent disturbance is basically like protected areas and stuff where there's no cutting or there's no disturbance caused by humans and all that. So in the first case, what happens when you cut down a lot of these trees and you cut it down repetitively every year, what happens? There's not a lot of favorable conditions. There's no trees and all for species to survive. So species such as birds and langurs and all, which need like trees to nest or trees to brood or sleep or all that, won't basically stay here. They'll become extinct or they'll move to some other place. So the diversity here will be low. On the other hand, if you have a very intact forest, what happens is that eventually, so initially there might be a lot of different species, but eventually due to competition and basically evolution, what happens? Some of the species which are not doing good, which are not very good at hiding from predators or basically getting food, will basically go extinct, and only a few species will survive. So and it will be a equilibrium. So basically, it will be called a competitive equilibrium because there's no competition anymore, but the number of species that are found here is less. What happens in case of medium disturbance is that since we are just cutting down a few trees or something, there are more basically niche that are found in the edges of these two. So there might be some birds which might now come here and basically sit on this tree and look at insects flying around here and then just go in and eat one of them. Right. So basically what is happening here is that these different new organisms are coming together and basically trying to uh, take advantage of this medium level of disturbance that is there, because their home is not lost. They can still live in the other trees that are found there, but they can come here to forage. Or there is some like smaller trees and grasses that are developing here, which is increasing the diversity of this place. So medium disturbance often leads to more biodiversity, whereas high or low amount of disturbances or very frequent or very infrequent disturbances lead to less biodiversity. Now, all this is okay. What is biodiversity? Why do we have more biodiversity here? Why do we have less biodiversity here? How do we quantify diversity? How do we measure the biodiversity? That all is okay. But now we want to know what is the value of this biodiversity? What does it basically mean? Right. What value does it hold? Right. Does anyone have any questions till now or any doubts? Feel free to
No,
unmute
sir.
yourself. Okay. Thank you. So basically, the total economic value of biodiversity can be divided into two types of values. The first is use value, and the second is non-use value. Use value is again divided into direct value, indirect value, and option value. And non-use value is divided into existence value, altruistic value, and bequest value. So what do they mean? So basically, there are two types of values I was saying, use value and non-use value. Use value is the value that arises out of use of the resource. So let's say you're going to a forest and you are cutting trees to get firewood. So you're basically using trees or using the resource to get some value out of it. You're generating fire, or you're basically using that firewood to cook and all that. Right. Non-use value, on the other hand, is the value that arises even though the resource is not being used. So basically, uh, what do you say? You might not directly be using a resource, but you might still be deriving some value out of it. For example, uh, you can just the fact knowing that there are all sorts of different organisms and all sorts of different animals and birds and plants all around us gives us some sense of joy, gives us some sense of wonder. Children are generally excited to see images of different kinds of animals, of different kinds of uh, birds, and all that. Right. So that's kind of a non-use value. Even though you are not using that particular bird or animal or anything, you're still getting some value, which is some joy or some enjoyment or some excitement out of it. Right. So again, like use value is divided into direct value, indirect value, option value. Non-use value is divided into existence value, altruistic value, and bequest value. Now we'll look at what all these are. So direct value can be of two types, consumptive and productive values and non-consumptive values. So consumptive values are basically values which consume the resource. So for example, going and cutting down trees to collect timber or firewood, or basically plucking out leaves or flowers to produce medicines and stuff from plants, and grazing and all that affect the plant. They basically, once you cut a tree, no one else can use that tree because that tree is not there anymore. So these are basically consumptive behaviors, consumptive things that you are doing, and you're gaining some value out of it. Non-consumptive values can be recreation, ecotourism, where you're just going there, seeing it, but you're not basically, uh, what do you say? So you're getting some recreation. You're basically going to a forest. You're disconnecting from your hectic life. You're taking a break and all that. So in that way, you're just going to a forest. You're looking at the trees, looking at the birds, animals, and everything, but you're not using them in a way that no one else can use them again. Right. So if you go there, you look at some bird or something, the next day someone else can go there and look at the same bird and derive some value out of it, some happiness or something. Right. So these are non-consumptive values, and direct values are values basically that are very direct. Right. You do something and you get some value directly. Indirect values are values that are basically indirectly provided to us and we don't directly account for them. So, for example, like groundwater recharge is something that uh, these ecosystems and different plants and all do. Uh, Plants can regulate the flow of streams, right? They can prevent soil erosion. They can uh, do all that. And uh, these are basically known as watershed benefits. The other thing for indirect value is ecosystem services such as waste assimilation, carbon sequestration, and other microclimatic functions. So, for example, you go uh, to not a forest, but let's say, for example, there is a place in a ground where there's a lot of trees, right? So what happens is the microclimate of that area or the temperature of that area will be relatively cooler compared to other areas. So on a hot, sunny day, if you're traveling outside, if you're walking out and you find a tree and you're basically sitting below that tree or something, It's basically because you feel cool there, right? So the microclimate of that area is affected by the presence of that tree. Even though you decide to sit or not sit or use or not use, it's some indirect thing that you can benefit from. Okay. And the other thing that biodiversity provides us is with global life support and biodiversity, which are categorized as evolutionary processes. Now, option value, the third kind of use value, is basically the option for future direct or indirect use of biodiversity. Right. So even though a piece of land, a piece of forest is not being used by you currently, in the future, you might have some direct or indirect use of that patch of forest or that patch of land. So let's say there's a patch of forest which has a lot of different trees and a lot of different animals, right? Someday down the lane, basically, let's say by research and all, you figure out that there is one species of tree that has some medicinal properties that was not discovered before. So someday down the lane, you can still gain some direct benefits from this tree or from this biodiversity that is present in that area. Right. So having that place there, having that biodiversity provides you with the option for future use. That is basically called as the option value of a given thing or option value of biodiversity. Now, the we are done with use values. For non-use values, we have existence value, altruistic value, and bequest value. Now, existence value is the value derived from the knowledge that resources continue to exist. As I was mentioning before, so children looking at basically pictures of giraffe or zebra or elephant and getting excited about them and getting joy out of them is basically uh, existence value. Even though you are not directly using it, even though you are not indirectly using it or anything, just knowing that, okay, there's a zebra out there in Africa or a elephant out there somewhere or something, some kind of life, some kind of form, gives you some sense of joy or uh, basically happiness, which is termed as the existence value. Altruistic value is basically the value derived from the knowledge of use of resources by others in the current generation. So let's say we have mm, a biodiverse area. Let's say we have a national park or a yeah, zoo or something, right? Which has a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different animals. There are people you know or you don't know who are working in the zoo, who are managing those animals, who are basically conserving them, who are feeding them, and all that, right? In the national parks and zoos and all that. So basically, those biodiverse resources are used by other people in your current generation, which might not be directly related to you, but the knowledge that there are other people using it and sustaining their life based on it is gives it some kind of value for you, which is the altruistic value. So you would be still happy that, okay, there is some place like the Kanha National Park where people are using it for all the different sorts of things. But even though you are not directly using it, but someone else is using it, and that's why it gives you a value. Bequest value is basically the value of letting things be for the future or for your offsprings. So let's say you have a patch of land or you have a patch of forest which has a lot of biodiversity. Then bequest value is basically the value that you get from that area by leaving it for your future generations. So they might do something with it, which they might need or they might want, but you don't want to use it currently. So basically, what you do is you bequest it upon them. So that gives it a bequest value. Now, all these different values that we derive from biodiversity. Uh, we are also interested in quantifying in terms of money how much uh, how much biodiversity is worth, how much a forest is worth, or how much a piece of ecosystem is worth, and all that. So for that, we have three accepted approaches of valuation. So the first one is market prices or revealed willingness to pay. So this has three methods. The first is market pricing method. So basically, you say you want to sell this piece of forest or sell this piece of land to someone and how much they're willing to pay for it. Right. That is the market price. Hedonic pricing method basically is like some pleasure that you derive from that resource, you're paying for that. So, for example, in Mumbai, if you have a sea facing apartment, it will be much more expensive than if you have an apartment somewhere inside the city, because inherently people want sea facing apartments because they get relaxed, they get joy out of looking at the sea uh, in the morning, or like they can just chill in their houses and all that. So this is called hedonic pricing method. So based on basically things like this, you decide on a price. The third is travel cost method. So let's say, for example, you want to estimate the cost of Kanha National Park. So you quantify what is the amount of money that people are spending to come here, to travel to here, and to look at this region or experience this biodiversity. And that is basically your travel cost method. Because if someone is coming from a different part of the world to look at something here, that means the amount of money that they are spending on traveling and coming here is worth it, right? Otherwise, they won't have come, right? So, for example, if I'm spending 10,000 rupees to go to Kanha National Park and look at a tiger, then that seeing a tiger is worth 10,000 rupees for me or more than that. Otherwise, I won't pay 10,000. Right. If I feel like seeing a tiger is not worth 10,000 rupees, I won't pay that much to go there. Right. The second approach is circumstantial evidence or imputed willingness to pay, where basically we have two things. One is replacement or substitute cost, and the second is damage cost avoided. So, for example, let's say you have a mountain, set of mountains here, and you have some trees, a forest here, right? And you have a river here. Now, what is the cost of this forest can be estimated circumstantially by either estimating the replacement or substitute cost or estimating the damage cost that is avoided. So let's imagine a situation where there's only these mountains and the river. The trees have been cut. So what happens? Now, since the river is coming down from the mountain, there'll be a lot more sediments with the river because the trees here are basically preventing soil erosion here on the mountains, holding on to the soil and not letting it go into the water. But if there are no trees, there'll be more sediment in the river. There'll be a lot more sediment deposition in the plains where the river finally becomes like the slope becomes lower. So there'll be a higher sediment load here. Fishes might die because of that. The river might alter its course if there is more deposition of sediment in one place and all that. Right. So damage cost avoided is basically estimating how much money it will take to basically clear out all these things. Right. Fishes dying, taking out these sediments and all that, how much money it will take. Right. What is the damage that is 1 second. Yeah. Sorry. So what is the damage that is done here? Changing of rivers, changing of the path of the river, fishes dying, how it will affect the fishermen population, how it will affect the people who are living here. These people who are living probably somewhere down here might not get water anymore. Right. So that is the damage that they are receiving because of the loss of trees. So estimating the cost of all these damages is called the damage cost avoided. So that is the circumstantial evidence of how much money is the forest worth. The other thing is replacement or substitute cost. So let's say we cut down all these trees, but we have to do something to prevent these disastrous consequences. So what we do is we put a geofabric on top of this. We have, let's say, filters in the river that filter out sediments, and we have done some sort of excavation or something here so that even if there is sediment, there is enough space for the sediment to settle down without affecting the river. So all these different substitutes or replacements that we are doing, instead of just having the forest, the cost of all of that combined will give us the replacement or substitute cost. Right. And the third and final accepted approach for valuation of biodiversity is surveys or expressed willingness to pay. So basically, you do a survey and you ask people how much are you willing to pay for this biodiversity, for this piece of forest, or for this grassland, or for this mm, pond ecosystem and all that, how much money you are willing to pay. And you get do a survey, you ask a lot of different people, and you basically come up with a number that is the value of that given area or given biodiversity, given ecosystem or given uh, patch of grassland or forest and so on. Right. Yeah. So that's all for today for this week's lecture. Does anyone have any questions or doubts regarding anything for this week or last week? Feel free to ask. PDF file for? Yeah, it will be uploaded in that same Google Drive link. You can get it there. I can share the link here again. Here's the link. I'll be uploading everything there, so you can just go there and download. I'll just go over whatever was there for this week once more. And if you guys have any questions, you can ask. So first we talked about the parable of two watchmakers and we understood. Okay. Okay, we have one question. Sir, where this valuation is used and why is it done? Okay, so basically this valuation. So basically, let's say you have a piece of forest somewhere, and but because of like development, the government wants to cut down the forest and let's say build a mall there or build a road there or something like that. So in that case, we have to estimate what will be the cost of removing that um, patch of forest for it to be converted into some other thing, such as let's say a road or agricultural area or even like a mall or whatever. So in that case, we use these valuations to come up with a number of, let's say, okay, this much loss we will get if we convert this forest into something else. But this is something we can tolerate. This is something we cannot tolerate. Based on that, they make decisions. So mostly this is used in like policy making probably and to for the government and for other uh, like authorities with power to take decisions regarding biodiversity. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay. So I'll just go over all of the things briefly. Yeah, so we first talk about the parable of two watchmakers, why they made watches, why one was successful, why one was not. We talked about hierarchy. We talked about Simon's hierarchical principle. Then we talked about the emergent properties and emergent principle, emergent properties of your like hierarchical systems. We talked about emergent behavior in fire ant traps, such as buoyancy, increased hydrophobicity, uh, elasticity, viscosity. We talked about the different levels of organization in the biological world, such as subcellular organelles, cells, tissues, um, organs, organ system, organism population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. We talked about what is biodiversity. Uh, we talked about what is biodiversity, species biodiversity, genetic biodiversity, uh, ecosystem biodiversity. We talked about how we measure and quantify biodiversity. How do we estimate the number of species? What indices we use to quantify biodiversity and equitability or evenness. We talked about the different measures of biodiversity, alpha, beta, and gamma biodiversity, biodiversity hotspots. Uh, we talked about the reasons why some areas have more diverse biodiversity and some areas have less. Uh, we talked about different hypotheses that people have put forward, like the evolutionary speed hypothesis, which says that biodiversity is more in areas which have more time to evolve and which have more rapid evolution. That is shorter generation times, higher mutation rates, or natural selection acting more quickly. We talked about geographical area hypothesis, where which states that there's more biodiversity in areas with larger area or physically and biologically complex habitats. We talked about interspecific interactions hypothesis, which says that there's more biodiversity in areas with competition and predation due to niche partitioning and uh, less competitive exclusion, respectively. We talked about the ambient energy hypothesis, which states that there's more biodiversity in areas with more energy and more climatically favorable conditions. Talked about intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which says that areas which are disturbed intermediately have more biodiversity than areas which have less disturbance or very high disturbance. We talked about how we can calculate, like how do we value biodiversity, use value, non-use value, direct value, indirect value. So direct value is basically the value that we get directly from it by consuming it or not consuming it. Indirect value is the value that we get indirectly. Option value is the value that we get by keeping this resource for future use, for our future use, future direct or indirect use. Existence value is the value that we get from the knowledge that the resource exists. Altruistic value is the value that we get from the knowledge that other people are using the resource and basically deriving some value out of it. Bequest value is the value that we get because of leaving the resource for our offspring or our future generations use. There's then we learned about the different methods of valuations that we can use to get at a monetary value for biodiversity. The market prices method, circumstantial evidence, where we basically get the uh, exact willingness of people to pay how much money they want. Circumstantial evidence method, where we basically estimate the cost indirectly. so the imputed willingness to pay, and surveys, which is basically the expressed willingness to pay, or this is how much I want, like how much I think that should cost, and things like that. That's all. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Yes, there is attendance for all the class, attendance count going on for all the classes. Does anyone have any other questions? Okay. So we'll stop today's class here. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be uploading the PPT to the drive link that I sent. And you can check the recording of this live session on YouTube. Thank you for attending. I'll see you next week at the same time.